Back in early 2024, I made a video on failed characters in Genshin Impact, listing off reasons why they failed to achieve anything of noteworthy relevance in the metagame. For some like Hydro Traveler and Dia, it was a combination of poor scaling and a lack of any clear through line for any of their abilities, whereas for others like Fremine, it was simply a lack of infrastructure put in place to support a playstyle like that. The video did extremely well, and there was a recurring comment I saw in the comment section pointing out that it's less about them coming out as failures, rather it was Genshin/Hoyo that failed them, much like how for example Venti by modern standards would be a disappointment of an Archon, but none of that is because of his own shortcomings, rather Hoyo's determination to stop him from insta-clearing every Abyss chamber. Whether you say they were sabotaged or failed, it's the same basic principle. Currently, as it stands, these characters never really had a shot in the metagame, and even if they did have a shot later down the road, they already got power grabbed either by the game collectively or by someone coming out who does the same thing better than them. In any case, today I want to make a part 2 covering some more failed characters by detailing what went wrong with them and what could potentially be done to fix them. Just like in the first episode, I feel the need to clarify, and I said this in both the HSR and WoA versions too, there's no such thing as a true failed character in Genshin. With enough time, effort, and investment, save for maybe the absolute worst units like Hydro Traveler, you can find at the very least some semblance of usability within them. The presence of Imaginarium Theater further underscores that, since in that game mode you have no choice but to make use of your lesser characters whether you want to or not. That being said, Genshin, like any other game with a team building strategy, is run by opportunity cost. There are more characters in the game than you're able to deploy at any given point in time, and if any of them were to overlap in function, attributes, what have you, naturally people will err on picking the ones that net the best results. The only time that notion gets overridden is if you have a personal preference towards someone, but at that point we've lost objectivity and relativity. Under no circumstances does anyone have a legitimate reason to pick Aloy over Ganyu, no reason whatsoever. Further, if there's zero reason for anyone to prioritize the character, that would be grounds for calling them a failure. Logically speaking, there's no point for them to exist if, assuming you have access to alternatives, you never played them, right? Having said that, Genshin unfortunately is a game that doesn't really distribute all units to every player at no cost. Operating off that, a reason could be made to pick a less optimal character if you don't have one of the other ones, but that in and of itself also presents a reason to not play them either. You have to go out of your way to get them. In other words, personal enjoyment aside, even if a character might have engaging gameplay or a well thought out design, they might be regarded as a failure on account of not delivering enough practical results. Someone I should have gone over in the first episode and might actually be Genshin's most objective failure, even more so than Dia and Taito MC, is Albedo. A complete tragedy considering how much he was built up back in versions 1 and 2, and even given series plot relevance as the creation of Gold and the recent story update they gave in 5.6. Narratively, he's one of the most fascinating characters in Mondstadt, but applicably, he's one of the most useless characters in all of Genshin Impact. I don't plan to mince words in this video. It would be one thing if Albedo's a 4-star or even a standard banner 5-star, but the fact that he's a limited 5-star that you have to actively go out of your way for is an even bigger slap in the face to him. To his credit, when he first came out, Albedo was decently usable thanks to doing a fair amount of damage in burst rotation teams and giving bonus elemental mastery to his team. Not to mention, back in version 1, we just didn't have that many characters, so by process of there being no competition, Albedo was made usable as a double Geo with Hu Tao, Zhongli, and Xingqiu. People also took advantage of him being a plunging attack enabler for Shao and Diluc. Waiting for the elevator each and every time though simply made it too slow of a win condition. There just wasn't a clear vision for Albedo's gameplay. His skill creates a geo construct that pulses out damage and gives people some verticality if they want. His burst is a blast of damage around him with no added effect. His A4 passive increases elemental mastery for the party, a frankly meaningless buff to have on a geo character given how bad Crystallize is by default. Even as a jack of all trades, Albedo doesn't really do anything conducive to a team's win condition. The only reason one had to include him in a team was Mono Geo as the third Geo character alongside Ito and Goro, but we're talking about a rogue strategy that very few people played even at its peak popularity since it was too expensive for effectively the same output as Raiden Shogun, Double Hydro, or Ayakai if not less. The real nail on the coffin for Albedo though was Chiori, who became the new best third Geo character for Mono Geo as well as Navia and carried way more personal damage than he did, removing any real incentive to play him whatsoever. Technically speaking, Albedo can slot into any team for easy damage. You just press E and Q and move on about your day. But by that thought process, you can do the same for any other character, and they could pitch in more for the team's overall DPS by personal merit. Now, Constellations could potentially be a saving grace for a character, especially if it lets them tap into a certain niche. In the case of Albedo, if you were crazy enough to pull for C4, he could become a decent support for Shao. However, there are much better characters who can buff not just Shao but many others and at a far cheaper price point. Being a Geo unit does not do him any favors either. Geo already sucks as an element. If hypothetically Albedo was Anima or some other supportive element, then you could find a justifiable excuse to pick him up. But at the present moment, he's one of the worst 5 stars in the game who belongs to the worst innate element in the game. If Genshin ever decides to pull an HSR and give us new forms of existing units, Albedo without question must be the first in line. One of the most wasted potential characters in Genshin, especially when you think about how much they hyped him up in version 1. Nowadays, people forget he even exists. Speaking of non-existing, it wouldn't be a failed Genshin character video without discussing the one unit Genshin actually tried to make us forget. Kaveh. Kaveh's a unit that had so many things working against him. First, let's recap on the whole Kaveh deleting Genshin Impact thing. For the uninitiated, when the broke college kit first came out, there was an exploit people found in multiplayer involving a skill that, as you know, would prematurely explode dendro cores and remove them. Hackers found a way to make it so Kaveh could use his skill on any interactable object, effectively deleting it from the game. They were able to remove statues of the 7, the tree that lets you claim artifacts and stuff at the end of a domain, or I believe NPCs, practically soft-locking you, especially since Genshin had no way of reloading them back in, or doing an entity check. So if you were a victim of this exploit, I believe there was no way to get your stuff back. It was bad, it was like really bad. As such, Hoyo basically never gave Kaveh a rerun for over a year. My guess is that it was a result of him being a risk to the game's public image if such a mistake were to ever happen again. The player base, unsurprisingly, took notice of this and started to pester Hoyo to bring the guy back in. The funny thing is, when they eventually did, no one wanted him. Kaveh is widely considered to be one of Genshin's worst characters and the definitive worst dendro character, the element known for not really having any actual bad units by virtue of how strong its elemental reactions are at base. Much like Albedo, there's next to no practical incentive to use him, especially when you think of the time he came out. Kaveh was one of the later dendro units to arrive in version 3, as in he came out after most players got their hands on Nahida, Alhaitham, Baitu, Yao and such. By nature, no pun intended, dendro's mostly a supportive element. The only reason Alhaitham made it work as a main DPS hybrid was thanks to Hoyo being quite generous with his numbers at the time of his release. His team was pumping numbers on par with the likes of Utal, Raiden Shogun, and whatnot, especially when used in concert with Nahida. Kaveh was given no such luxury. He was so weak that even a main DPS Nahida could do more than he could. You actually kneecapped yourself by using him because the whole gist of his gameplay is to rupture normal bloom cores, despite normal bloom cores being much weaker than their hyper bloom and burgeoning counterparts. Technically, bountiful cores count as normal bloom cores, which would have you believe Kaveh can be a dendro main attacker for Nilo Bloom. The irony is that Kaveh is one of the worst characters to use in Nilo Bloom. The only thing you can use him for is to augment dendro core damage. But you can only do that by being on field, and if your goal is to increase dendro damage, then you might as well just play into Hyper Bloom or Burgeon and get your stronger bloom cores that way. It would be one thing if Kaveh could buff dendro cores off field, since you wouldn't have to waste your main DPS slot for that. Unfortunately, he doesn't have that privilege, so on top of having this big scandal that kept him underground for over a year, Kaveh was also just really poorly thought out when they made him, to the point where some theory crafters argue he's bottom 5 worst characters in Genshin. Quite an accomplishment when you think about how broken dendro as an element is. I think we have time for 2 more. Let's go over Ifa. I actually never heard his pronunciation in game. Ifa is another 4-star character that came out fairly recently, although I feel like people don't even know who he is. I don't really blame them. He came out during the filler period of Genshin and didn't make a very big splash either, which is a shame. People very much were looking forward to his inclusion, not just for being the only male character to come out in months, but his appearance made people think he would be a 5-star. So Hoyo started him off on the right foot, disappointing everyone by being a 4-star. The trend continues once again all the same. Ifa plays out in a similar fashion to Mizuki, wherein his elemental skill brings him into a special state that changes his normal attacks. Whenever attacking, his attacks also heal the party, and then his elemental burst is a blast of animo damage with a bit of grouping into it. He's also got a bit of supportive utility, namely in taser teams, as he can buff Electro and Lunar Charge as well as Swirl for the party. He can also do some elemental reaction damage thanks to his A4 and C4 boosting his elemental mastery. Putting it all together, he's a mixture between a sub DPS and healing support. Being an Animo and Night Soul user affords him a selection of universal supportive utility as well. So at a glance, he would appear to be more usable than either Albedo or Kaveh, right? Objectively, yes, absolutely. In relativity though, the answer is still no. Arguably, the biggest reason he would be considered a failure pertains to the time he came out. For all intents and purposes, Ifa is an entirely superfluous addition to the game. He's the closest you can get to being a carbon copy of Mizuki without actually being a carbon copy, that being buffing swirl damage and healing the team. Having just recently made a Wino in Place episode on the standard units wherein I included Mizuki, the 5-star therapist is one of the more underwhelming 5-stars in the game and bar none the weakest 5-star in version 5. She doesn't deal enough damage to merit being the main attacker, nor is her buffing capability really all that impressive. In addition, Mizuki's healing is nowhere near sufficient enough to power fanfare stacks on Verena, and she pretty much gets outperformed by a decently invested Sucrose in DPS contribution and support. Now, in defense of Ifa, he's got the option to run either Cinder City or Virtus Inventor, and though he is a non-fielder with this skill, it's not quite as obligatory as Mizuki. However, he still suffers some identical flaws to her. Low damage, low buffing utility, low healing. You're looking at a guy who's essentially a reprint of an underwhelming 5-star, and he came out in 5.6 while being weaker than Sucrose, who came out in 1.0. Mind you, Anemo is currently dealing with a diversity crisis or lack thereof, where it feels like all Anemo units are pigeonholed into being either Sucrose and Kasuha or Jean in terms of playstyle if they want to be usable. In simple terms, Ifa is just not a very memorable character as a result of being a reprint of niches that already have several candidates to pick from. On the subject of reinventing the wheel, the last one I want to talk about, and I would wager it's a controversial one, is going to be Cyno. Now, I want to go on record and clarify that Cyno's a fair degree higher than the three I talked about so far. The problem with him goes a bit deeper than simply being weak or not having a legitimate incentive to be used. Quite the opposite, if you were to invest hella into Cyno and give him the best teammates, you could actually make a fairly powerful attacker. There's just one catch: Cyno took too long to get there. In a similar fashion to a lot of failed characters like Dia, Ifa, Albedo and stuff, people were very excited for Cyno when he came out, expecting him to be the spiritual successor to Racer in that he would have the same rushdown rapid attack playstyle as him, but with the power budget of a 5-star unit and not being physical. While that may be true, he came out a lot weaker than people thought he would be. Cyno's missing a lot of things in his kit that need to be supplemented by other characters. The issue is that a proper party for him didn't really manifest until version 4 more than a full year after he came out, at which point we got our hands on many other extremely powerful attackers. The first best in slot team Cyno got was himself, Nahida, Baichu, and Farina, a full 5-star team consisting of many units that get competed over by other characters. But even with them, Cyno's damage ended up being comparable to Koting with the same investment, if not marginally worse. Electro main DPS is already not the best when it comes to drawing from its own power to supplement carries. Cyno was built around getting carried by Dendro reactions, so he doesn't really have the same internal power that Hoyo later gave to Clorant and especially Varesa. It doesn't help that Electro units overlap with each other in general quite a bit, as in there's not much of a difference between Koting, Cyno, and Clorant if your goal is to have an Electro main attacker who revolves around Dendro. When Clorant in particular came out, she was to Cyno what Shiori was to Albedo. Pragmatically, if your goal is to get the most bang for your buck, Clorant can do more than Cyno can for less of the cost. One example out of many would be that she can heal herself, driving fanfare generation for Farina on her own, something Cyno has to rely on a healer for, thereby expending party slots with which he could get more damage out of. Again, he is a strong character when you get him going. In contrast to Albedo and Kaveh, who are functionally pointless to invest in, there is merit and reward obtained by gearing up Cyno. But at that level of investment, you can make anyone strong, especially in the Electro department. I'm fairly certain even Raiden Shogun Hypercarry can outpump Cyno. In a way, I suppose you can equate it to being similar to Ifa, where Cyno's usable, but in order of priority, he's like your 4th or 5th best choice. In case you're wondering if I might be too cynical with the Maha Mantra, I distinctly recall videos being made on characters people regret pulling for the most, and Cyno almost always finds its way into that discussion. What could be done to fix these guys? Short of directly buffing them, there's not much. Again, in the case of Albedo, I think he desperately needs a Dan Heng March 7 treatment and get a new form. It could also fit into his narrative background at the very least. Regarding Cyno and Ifa, that's tricky. Ifa would only be worth using if you were perhaps brand new to the game, but for anyone who's been playing for a while, you can find many better animal supports than him. Cyno as well, they're not in the same niche, but you could go for Varesa or Clorant before him. They're just cheaper to max out team comp wise, and anything that would buff Cyno would also buff Clorant and by extension Koting, seeing as they're all in the same line of work. Honestly, they all need direct buffs. None of them have anything that can make them get indirectly buffed disproportionately more than their peers. At the same time, in their current condition, they're gonna continue being obscure. But then again, it's not like they're the only ones Hoyo chose to abandon. I might make a part 3 and include Eula at this point. What do you guys think about the 4 units I talked about today? Do you agree or disagree with my points on them? Let me know in the comments down below. That'll be all for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and why not check out my first Failed Characters episode if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.